You're listening to 17 Carat K-Pop. For more information about the variety of topics covered on the show, as well as my other podcast, How to Stan, visit 17caratkpop.weebly.com. And if you enjoy this episode, please consider becoming a monthly donor to support my work and allow it to continue to go on and be free for all to access for as low as 99 cents a month. Visit the Support the Show link on my site's homepage for more information. Welcome back to 17 Carat K-Pop. Today we are starting a spin-off series of sorts from my BT Study Guides episodes. That 7-part series dove specifically into the works of art, literature, and cinema that BTS drew inspiration from while crafting their song and music video universe. Now what I'd like to do is talk about more literature that I have explored just because BTS convinced me to. So these stories are recommendations from Kim Namjoon, RM, who is a big reader, and he reads a lot of really deep, thought-provoking books. So I've been reading a lot of his recommendations, and I want to share with you my takes on them in my overall review. So when I do extrapolate from these stories and make connections to BTS's work, please know that it is just an extrapolation. So this is basically the BT Study Guide series of episodes, only without the overt connection. So it's probably an unintentional connection, but it is just an interesting way to see RM's worldview and BTS's worldview. Because with each of these stories, I do see the appeal to him, and the way that some of these stories have similar symbols, messages, sometimes even plots, you'll notice, that really seem to mirror what is in their stories. So consider BT Study Guides the official guide to BTS literature references. And RM's Rex is going to be a new series of episodes for the unofficial, unconfirmed, potential sources of literary influence. Today we're going to talk about 3 classic stories. So here's your condensed guide to The Stranger, The Catcher in the Rye, in 1984. Let's start with The Stranger by Albert Camus. This is a book by this French philosopher. This is a French novella from the 1940s. It's described as a story, quote, of the nakedness of man faced with the absurd, unquote. This is actually from the author of The Plague as well. The Stranger could not be a bestseller at first. It couldn't even qualify because only 4,400 copies were physically printed. There were limitations on its printing and distribution because it was the 40s, and the Nazi occupation of France affected its release, stalled its release as it had to go through a censorship test of sorts, but it eventually was released and became a very popular read among anti-Nazis. It seems to be part of the same universe as his book, The Plague. I highly recommend The Plague too, by the way. It's quite interesting. And it's been adapted into 2 films, one in Italian and one Turkish. It's a really great embodiment of Albert Camus' work. So not just his writing style, but it encapsulates his thinking style, you could say. His views on absurdism and existentialism. He gets really deep and philosophical. The meaning in his work does not come from the surface level plots and symbols. It's reading between the lines. It's the underlying themes and patterns in his work to pay attention to. Similar to BTS's music videos, you need to take it in carefully and parse through it to get the most out of it. This story centers around a murder, part 1 before the murder, part 2 after the murder. The main character is this French settler named Meursault. He seems to only experience apathy or interest. So he does look at things critically and curiously, but he doesn't show emotion. So when people are expected to be extra emotional, he is not. He comes across as very stoic. After all, the story starts out with he goes to his mom's funeral and doesn't shed a tear. And when asked if he wants to see her body, he decides not to. He goes to smoke at the vigil. Then he starts having an affair a few days later. He just does not have emotional depth. He is this neighbor Raymond Raymond thinks his girlfriend's cheating on him. So Merceau decides to help him out, find out if she's cheating, and decides to help Raymond with this really awful plan to get back at her. It's a long story. But he agrees to cooperate without hesitation, without qualms. He doesn't have sympathy for this girlfriend, and he doesn't have this sense of innocent until proven guilty. Raymond and his girlfriend end up fighting physically one morning, and the cops are called. Raymond then begs Merceau to testify in court later on his behalf, which he agrees to do. Meanwhile, that person he started having an affair with, Marie, suggests they get married, and he's like, sure, why not? Doesn't seem to really care if they do or not, but he's like, sure, if it'll please you, why not? So the main characters, Raymond, Merceau, and Marie, go over to this beach cabin. They're at this vacation home. That's where they find Raymond's girlfriend's brother with an Arab person. None of the Arab characters in this story are given names, by the way, which we'll get to later. But anyway, this Arab person, Raymond previously mentioned, had been following him lately. So this girl Raymond suspects has been cheating on him, and this Arab person he suspects of following him are caught together. A big confrontation is provoked. Raymond ends up getting stabbed during the fight. So to prevent Raymond from retaliating too violently, and to really let his anger in the heat of the moment get to him, Merceau takes Raymond's revolver away from him, so he doesn't do anything stupid. He ends up walking down the beach by himself afterwards, just holding this revolver, and then he comes across the girlfriend's brother, who had been the person with the Arab, and shoots and kills him. Doesn't express any remorse, characteristically. So part 2 shows Merceau in jail, seeming just as apathetic as ever. He passes time just by listing objects in his head, talking to himself, not thinking back on emotional memories. Just, he has that very logical, rational mind that gets rid of all emotional elements of your mind. When he's tried, the prosecution focuses less on his crime and more on his lack of emotion. So instead of proving he did it by showing the revolver and its fingerprints and stuff, they focus on just showing because he didn't display emotion in these past incidents, and they bring up his mom's funeral again, he must be guilty. He must be a heinous person. Merceau acknowledges his lack of external emotions and said it's because he's so focused on the present moment. So he doesn't dwell on past memories, good or bad. He doesn't plan for the future with any expectations, good or bad. And therefore he never feels remorse or anything, because that would require thinking back to something that you already did. Obviously, that argument does nothing for you in court, and he is sentenced to a public beheading. He continues to have this nothing matters mentality, and gets really mad, lashes out at this chaplain who comes to him right before the beheading. Because he is an atheist and he doesn't want to see this chaplain, but also he just gets short-tempered because he has that totally different worldview of not preparing for an afterlife, of just nothing matters. But he ends up quite content at the end of his life, dying alone, because he thinks, I'm just like my mom was at the end of her life, alone in a retirement home. One more thing before we unpack this. There is this interesting side story where a neighbor, Salamano, owns this dog, who he both loves and harms, is a terrible owner to. He's so comforted by this dog in times of need, and he despises this dog. Then he ends up venting to Merceau at times, and says the neighbors have been bad-mouthing you behind your back, forever sending your mom to a retirement home, which is surprising to Merceau. He never thought that was a bad thing to do, and he never thought about what he did in the past anyway. Literary scholars debate fiercely to this day what Camus is really trying to say with this story. There's no clear-cut answer. The closest we got to a clear answer is what Camus said in 1955, quote, "In our society, any man who does not weep at his mother's funeral runs the risk of being sentenced to death. I only meant that the hero of my book is condemned because he does not play the game," unquote. As I've been very open about on the show before, I'm on the autism spectrum. I get that. That's probably why I was drawn into this story, because I always feel for the characters who are shamed for not showing emotions, quote unquote, the normal way. People who are not neurotypical fail to express themselves in the way society wants them to. Those characters I always kind of relate to. Critical difference, though, is that this guy is made out to be a character without those emotions at all. Whereas for people like me, we still have those emotions. We just don't convey them publicly in the same external ways. So I just want to put that caveat out there. So you can hate this character for lacking all sympathy and care. Please don't, though, for him not crying at the funeral, not doing other quote-unquote normal displays of emotion. That's not the issue with this character. And maybe that nuance is what Camus is really trying to point at. And maybe that's his commentary, that everyone condemned him right away, without stopping to think about why he might react in an unexpected way. They automatically assume the worst of him. It's so interesting, he said, I only meant that the hero is condemned because he does not play the game. Does he mean the social scripts, social norms, or does the game refer to something else entirely? People debate too, is he really leaning into his existentialism views or his absurdism views? Because that's a whole other debate we could have about those approaches being mutually exclusive. There's also debate about the name of this book. Who is the stranger? Is it one of the unnamed Arab characters? Is it this main character who acts like he's a stranger to emotion? Is the stranger the murder victim? That's up to you to decide. There's also quite a back and forth about the purpose of not naming the Arab characters, especially because this character, again, is a French settler, travels to Algeria, and so it's replicating that dynamic of colonizer and colonized, not bothering to know the name of the person whose land you're stepping on. There is an alternative version of this novel called The Meursault Investigation that came out in 2013-2014 that gives more of a voice to that brother of the victim, gives him a name and a backstory, and characters do mourn him as a full person. Very much like A Tempest, which rewrote Shakespeare's The Tempest to reframe Caliban as a victor, proud of who he is. I personally love that version way more than Shakespeare's, and authors have tried to do a similar flipping of the dynamics in this case. Story 2 is truly bizarre. I do not understand why this is a literary classic. Parts of it, I do appreciate the symbolism of the deeper messages, but at a just narrative level, this story is insane. The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger was seen in the background in the Danger BTS music video. We'll talk about more connections later. It's set in the 1950s. No specific location is given, but the main character, Holden, seems to be talking from some sort of mental institution he's in. And he's narrating a series of events between the end of his fall term at school and Christmas time. He's the 16-year-old who acts like a 16-year-old boy. He flirts and talks about sex all the time. He's also a character who's very socially weird because of that. He doesn't get social scripts or norms, what's appropriate and what's not. He basically doesn't know how to read a room. So this 16-year-old boy, who is facing expulsion for the 4th time from another school, has all these conversations with a cast of characters about all sorts of stuff. And he makes it always so awkward. He keeps trying to have interactions, and usually he's his own worst enemy with those interactions. Although I will say some of the other characters prompt more absurdity and prompt more weirdness in their interactions. But the awkwardness goes both ways. So he talks to some nuns, who he ends up giving money at the end of their conversation, as if, like, paying them for a favor. This elevator operator he talks to sends someone up to his room for $5, and then she ends up stealing another $5 from him. It's a long story. He talks to moms, he talks to teachers, he talks to 3 women in their 30s and makes comments about their age. That causes them to get up and leave him with their check. There's a lot going on here. He angers this girl he has a crush on, Sally, because he calls her a pain in the, for rejecting the suggestion. They run away together. He has such an ego, so unlikable, fights with his roommate. Holden ends up kicked out of that prep school. He has to go tell his little sister, and she's outraged. It's important to know that his 10-year-old sister, Phoebe, knows him better than anyone. She gets him on such an intense level. So as mad as she is at him, she truly cares about him. Basically, all of his relationships are so forced and not happening, going nowhere, that it just makes this brother-sister relationship all the stronger and more special. So the one true relationship built on loyalty and love is between Holden and Phoebe. So anyway, Holden is talking to Phoebe. After he tells her he got kicked out of the school, he fantasizes about becoming a catcher in the rye. Quick trigger warning about a mention of suicide. He knew a guy who committed suicide by jumping off a building. That memory traumatizes him to this day, and now he dreams about becoming someone who catches anyone who falls. The thing is, Holden misremembered that line from a Robert Burns poem. He fantasizes about this time where a bunch of kids are playing, and when they fall because they're too close to the edge of a cliff in this daydream of his, he will be the one to catch them. So he remembered the poem as saying, "If a body catch a body coming through the rye." Phoebe has to correct him and say, "You've been totally misremembering that. It's if a body meet a body coming through the rye." Very different meaning if you're saying catch a body versus meet a body through the rye. And yes, that's a sexual innuendo, which makes that part of their conversation all the more noteworthy for their characters. It's so ironic because he spent this whole book talking about sex and stuff and trying to act like this big guy who's so mature, and a sexual metaphor goes right over his head. He really just has no idea. He viewed it as this nice innocent poem, totally misremembered it while trying to sound and act older than he really is. And his 10-year-old sister was the one who got to correct him. Holden decides to run away from home. He's leaving once and for all. He leaves a note with Phoebe at our school saying, "When you read this, come meet me at the Museum of Natural History." Side note, this is a place he really takes comfort in because it is unchanging. The world around him is so fast and changing, but the museum is always the same. It's stuck in time. Note that for later. So Phoebe meets him at this museum to say goodbye. And surprise, she brought luggage with. She says, "I'm coming with you." He doesn't want her to. He insists she can't come with. So he turns around to leave, but he knows she's following him. And so he ends up changing plans and walking to the carousel. So while she's there, he's like, might as well give her a fun afternoon before letting her down. He buys her a ticket. The story pretty much ends there, where she is blissfully just smiling and riding the carousel. And he's just standing there, tears welling up in his eyes, so excited for her, watching her ride it. He ends the story by telling readers that he's not going to bore you with the details about how he got from that carousel scene to the institution he is narrating from. He basically just says, "I ended up going back home and am very optimistic and hopeful that I will start at a new school next year and do much better, really change the course of my life." He feels like he's ready for a fresh start. There's an interesting contradiction in his tone, though, because it's the exact same tone he's had this whole book. He's had this tone of just extreme disdain for his own way of life right now. He's not happy at all with where his life is and acts as if it could never get better. But in that same tone, he manages to say this stuff about, "No, really, I am excited to have a fresh start next year, embark on a brand new chapter in my life, turn a page," all that kind of stuff. So readers are left to interpret for themselves if he's just bluffing, maybe to get out of the psych ward, or if he really means it this time. Maybe seeing Phoebe on the carousel did change something in him. The part of this story I think resonates with BTS's work and corresponds to it the most is that carousel scene. and other scenes where the symbolism is about youth in that sense that you want time to stand still. That theme running through their work of feeling like you just want the world to slow down, maybe go back in time, figure out what memories to hold on to, what about the past you want to hold on to, and how to prepare yourself mentally for leaving that chapter of your life. Then, of course, there is the depression touched on in the book, and other themes that reminded me of parts of BTS's story. There's also this major symbol made out of a bright red hat he wears, because it's described as a super weird, attention-grabbing hat he wears. And throughout the book, he simultaneously talks like it's the worst thing ever and he wishes he could take it off, and talks about it like there's no way he can ever take it off. I think it's this subconscious need for recognition and attention, even if it's bad attention, better than being ignored and invisible. And I think he, as a character, is feeling invisible, and that's why he says a lot of awkward head-turning stuff, and wears that ugly hat, and runs away from home. I think it's kind of a cry for help in a way, as he tries to discover who he is and how he wants to approach adulthood, which he doesn't in this story. He really wants to cling to childhood, which is why he fantasizes about just saving kids, being there to catch them. He's truly still such a kid at heart, and that's what the story, I think, is getting across. And that is also, I think, where if you're a big fan of BTS and or have checked out my BT Study Guides episodes, you see the parallels. The other big symbol, this pond of ducks, is described as a pond that's partly frozen and partly not frozen, which seems to represent that half and half mode between childhood and adulthood as you struggle to find your place in the world. And that pond has ducks on it, which he keeps asking his driver about, which is another interesting break from his usual scripts. Kind of like with the Catcher in the Rye reference, he wants to sound so mature at all times that sometimes he basically seems to break character in a way and act quite immature. And that is the one main question he asks without any pretense of trying to act like an adult. The one question he asks just out of this innocence, this pure curiosity. Like a little kid, he keeps nagging this driver of his where the ducks go in the winter. I think that's a more meaningful piece of dialogue than what meets the eye. Lastly today, let's talk about 1984 by George Orwell. This is one that RM mentioned he's read multiple times in an interview with KBS, and honestly, I highly recommend this one for anyone who ever uses the word Orwellian, because that word has been terribly misunderstood. Intentional ignorance has been applied here. You shouldn't be allowed to use the word Orwellian if you haven't read Orwell. Anyway, mini rant over. This story is a dystopian one, with thought police in a constant surveillance state, revisionist history. It's about this society where there's this ruling party that tries to control everything you say and think and remember, so they constantly update their history records to reflect the history they would prefer you to believe. This group, just called the Party, top secret work they do. No character knows what they're doing, or how they live. There's a lot of bureaucracy, shrouded in secrecy, but they still have to be treated like the Almighty, and if you don't comply, they will find out because they have surveillance. And signs posted everywhere that say, Big Brother is watching you. No one really ever knows if Big Brother is even real. Is he a person? It's kind of like the Wizard of Oz in that mysterious way, but only you never see the man behind the curtain, or if it's a man at all. But people are told to worship him, basically. They're working on a new language called Newspeak, which omits all words and references the party decides are too rebellious. So thoughts and speech and actions are all heavily surveilled and policed. The story stars this 39-year-old named Winston Smith. He's in a lower-ranking part of the ruling party. The difference between how the low-ranking and high-ranking officials live and operate, worlds apart. Obvious social commentary there. He works in the Ministry of Truth, where it's his job to keep changing history to the party's liking, even when he knows it's not true. For example, the party says, make it sound like we were formed in 1930, Winston thinks it was more like 1960, which would be a big difference. Rather than be too scared to do anything, Winston seems fearless. And part of it is ironically because he is constantly surveilled. Since he thinks any moment could be his last moment of freedom before an arrest or punishment by the government, he lives every moment to the fullest. So he buys a diary, even though he knows he's about to get caught for his unique thoughts and writing them down. He knows he's a prime target of the people surveilling him, so why not just live up to their expectations? Winston is convinced that this high-ranking official, O'Brien, is actually a secret member of the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood is a group that is working in secret to overthrow the party. So you got the party controlling everything, Winston resisting, and Winston speculating that O'Brien is also resisting as part of the Brotherhood. One incident that really drives home how devoid of emotional trains of thought they are, how they've been brainwashed and programmed over time to not think in terms of emotions at all, is when this girl named Julia passes Winston a note. He automatically fears it's a warning about his impending arrest or some other punishment he needs to get. So he is so surprised to see the note that says she loves him. She wants to be with him. His mind was just not programmed to assume when someone hands you a note that it's a cute love letter. Not at all in the realm of possibility in his head before this. Winston and Julia then are quickly smitten and start having an affair. There's this guy, Mr. Charrington, who is a great help for this. He even lends them this room to have their affairs in without cameras in it. A rare cameraless room. O'Brien sends a notice to Winston and Julia, saying he wants to talk to them. And it turns out, he tells them, yes, I am a part of the Brotherhood, I admit it. And I can indoctrinate the two of you into our rebellious society too. Here, read this. And it's Emmanuel Goldstein's book. It's a book that is treated like the Bible in the Brotherhood. It is the text that they live by. So O'Brien leaves them to it, and they do. Winston and Julia start reading this book. Turns out, this was all a big setup. O'Brien has been working undercover all along, passing along information as an informant to the party. He was never a part of the Brotherhood or the Resistance, but he caught them in a trap, because even if he can't prove any of the previous charges of rule breaking, because there's no camera evidence or whatever, he can now prove they just read from this resistance guide. Arrest them. It turns out also Mr. Charrington was a part of this too, the one who lent the cameraless rooms to them. He is also working with the party. He's a member of the Thought Police, so he may have been the one to tip off the others. Soldiers barge in and take them away. Winston ends up spending months tortured, brainwashed, and imprisoned. And eventually, he's sent to the dreaded Room 101. A place no one knows what happens in. In Room 101, he's subjected to this medieval torture device involving a cage full of rats that eat his face. It's so gross. So during this rat-eating torture, he caves. Months of resistance later, the rats wore him down, and he tells them to go torture Julia instead of him. He throws his girl under the bus. O'Brien sees this as the ultimate vindication moment. But now Winston is like, what have I done? He writes in his diary about this, saying basically, I'm already dead. Saying he was basically willing to die for the cause now, for freedom, for autonomy. But he also says, quote, if they could make me stop loving you, that would be the real betrayal, unquote. Turns out he committed the real betrayal, I guess. He had that choice between conformity and autonomy, and he ended up choosing conformity against readers' expectations, probably. From the book, quote, he had won the battle over himself. He loved Big Brother, unquote. So, by turning over Julia, he basically proved to the party that he's been properly brainwashed and is free to go. And when he does, he's changed as a person. He no longer has any feelings towards Julia and is entirely devoted to Big Brother in the party and becomes another loyal servant of theirs. that's the ending. So there's a lot there to think about. Again, I see some BTS parallels in the thought of remembering and forming emotions with other people, the risks you take for a loving relationship, the purpose of love and bonding with others, the importance of individuality, agency, developing your own voice to speak yourself, as they say. BTS also always sings about conformity and trying to not be putting yourself in a box too much, and question anyone who acts holier than thou. Bureaucracies, people, rules, institutions. Their music challenges listeners to question the people who claim to be ultimate arbiters of some sort of objective definition of justice or accuracy or fairness, etc. Just provoking that critical thinking and the sense of love, trying to make love conquer all, I see as relevant themes to BTS's work as well. Two more interesting details about this book. One is there's an interesting dynamic between Julia and Winston, because Julia thinks they should just take comfort in quiet rebellion, under the radar subtle forms of resisting, whereas Winston doesn't have time for that. He wants just outright bold out of the gates, public signs of rebellion. So their versions of protesting the expected norms in the society are totally opposite ideas for the right approach. So the relationship is just a very interesting dynamic because love was the power that got them to compromise. But the second love was overpowered by a medieval torture device with rats. Turns out love could not conquer that. One last thing, I think this is supposed to be super deep about how there is no bright side to a totally conformist culture, but I prefer to think of it not in the deep way, but it just is so funny to me. Winston describes this, quote, place where there is no darkness that he really wants to go in, that he really aspires to enter someday. The place where there is no darkness. So I guess the lesson is careful what you wish for, because he does go to a place where there is no darkness. It's a jail cell where the lights are left on 24/7. So overall, these classic stories deal with individuality and the constraints on that individuality, the pains of growing up and trying to hold on to your inner child, how you express emotions and how policed those emotions are, and plenty more takeaways I could have about how this applies to BTS's work. But these three literary examples I will just leave you with to create your own conclusions as well. Really interesting, thought-provoking books. If I had to recommend you read one of them in full, I would say 1984 is the best read, more subjectively speaking. Alright, moving on to more books. In episode 2 of RM's Rex, thank you for listening to today's. I will talk to you all again very, very soon.